Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our keynote panel on geopolitical disputes in Asia-Pacific. I'm Helman Sitohang, head of the Investment Bank for Asia-Pacific for Credit Suisse, and our moderator today is David Hewitt, our co-head of Global and Oil and Gas Research at Credit Suisse. Let me first introduce our three distinguished speakers. Mr. Shotaro Yachi, Special Advisor to the Cabinet of the Government of Japan. Mr. Yachi is also a professor at Waseda University's Organization for Japan-US Studies and a part-time guest professor at Keio University's Faculty of Policy Management. Mr. Yachi worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs between 1969 and 2008. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Yachi. Dr. Matthew Burrows was appointed counselor to the National Intelligence Council in July 2007 and director of the analysis and production staff in January 2010. He was the principal writer for the NIC publication, Global Trends 2030, Alternative Worlds, which has received worldwide recognition from the media, think tanks, and academics. Great to have you with us, Dr. Burrows. We also have Professor Zhang Weiwei, Professor of International Relations at Fudan University in China and visiting professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations in Switzerland. Professor Zhang worked as a senior English interpreter for the late China paramount leader Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders in the 1980s. He has written extensively in English and Chinese on China's foreign policy and political and economic reforms. Professor Zhang is also an experienced traveler who has been to over 100 countries in the world. Good to have you with us, Professor Zhang. Thank you. Many of us are aware of the dispute between Japan, China, and some other Asian nations over the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. But this is just one element of the geopolitical issues in the region. As Asia-Pacific becomes a more dominant economic and political force, it is inevitable that countries both inside and outside the region will seek to exert their influence over the region and look for ways to ensure they have a presence that will give them a strategic advantage. This can manifest itself in many ways, from controlling trade routes, establishing a military presence, or providing economic support. So the ultimate question is, do regional geopolitical disputes present a threat or an opportunity for the region's economic and political development? We have three eminent speakers to debate this issue. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Yachi, Dr. Burrows, and Professor Zhang.
Okay, we'll make a start, ladies and gentlemen. I was going to make a few comments about why geopolitical pressures are important. Helman's already covered it. It's standing room only, so you obviously understand how important it is as well. Let's just make a start. Professor Zhang, if you could maybe kick us off for about 10 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Mr. Sitohang, for your kind introduction. It's a great honor to come to the AIC conference. And our topic today is geopolitical issues in the Asia-Pacific region, a real threat or political rhetoric. From my humble Chinese view, I think it's both. But most probably, the threat can be mitigated, and rhetoric can be more rhetorical than substantial, and the Asia-Pacific region may remain the world's most dynamic region in the years to come. Take the Sino-Japanese dispute over the Diaoyu Islands, or Senkaku Islands, as claimed by the Japanese, as an example. And the dispute can be threatening to the regional peace and stability, and even prosperity, if it runs out of control. And the political rhetoric abounds over this dispute in both China and Japan. From a Chinese perspective, there was a Sino-Japanese understanding in 1972 when the two countries established diplomatic ties that the issue should be shelved. And then this understanding, or tacit understanding, was renewed in 1978 when the two sides signed this peace treaty, Treaty of Friendship and Peace. And Deng Xiaoping, I remember, gave a press conference, and he said openly, our future generations may be wiser and more intelligent, so we shelve the issue for the moment and leave it for the future generation. Yet, it's also true that Japan claimed that somehow this understanding did not exist. Yet, again, it's also a fact that Japan was cautious about the issue for almost 20 years, actually did not challenge the Chinese claim for almost 20 years. So I think perhaps the Chinese claim that such a tacit understanding did exist. However, for whatever reason, it's broken. And from Chinese point of view, by Japan's unilateral action to nationalize the islands. From my point of view, most probably it's more driven by the logic of Japan's domestic politics, the rise of nationalism after, at least from many observers in China, a 20 so-called lost 2 decades, and the successive change of weakened or weak governments for over 10 years. But it's also true that there are changes on the part of China. For Beijing, again, this very humble Chinese view, since this understanding was broken by Japan, so why China should honor its part of the commitment? So it gives Beijing freer hand to redress the balance over the de facto control of the islands. And Beijing now starts regular marine and even sometimes air surveillance over the island since Japan's unilateral declaration of the nationalization of the islands. Of course, behind China's reaction, or some people say very strong reaction, is China's vastly expanded economic and military clout, thanks to 3 decades of almost, in average, 10-year growth, continuous growth, following 3 decades of constant reforms and development. And also, it has to do with a rising pressure from the Chinese public. But we shouldn't be too pessimistic. It's true that Japan's de facto control has been broken, but the situation of the Diaoyu Islands is not out of control. First, despite political rhetoric, both sides try hard to avoid military confrontation. Second, neither Japan nor China want to fight a war with each other, as economic interests are already closely intertwined with each other. Thirdly, the United States, Japan's major ally, may not be very happy to see a dynamic, vigorous cooperation between China and Japan, but it does not want to see a war between Japan and China, which could unnecessarily undermine the US core interests. Furthermore, China and the United States are already closely linked by trade and other relationship. And I checked the bilateral trade volume, reached already $500 billion US. And there are over 90 platforms of all kinds, political, economic, military, academic, for communications, dialogues, conversations, negotiations of all sorts between the two sides. I don't know, perhaps around 100 of daily flights between the two countries. And I think there are no logic for military confrontation between China and United States. And China's new leadership, Xi Jinping, not long ago, I think, said to Jimmy Carter, the ex-US president, that China and the United States should strive for a new type of big power relationship and should, what he used the term, positive energy, to make best use of the positive energy rather than negative energy between the two sides. In other words, there are positive aspects and negative aspects between the two countries in the Sino-US relationship. But we try to really make best use of the positive aspects and then try to reduce our differences to the degree possible. It's inconceivable that the two countries, China and the United States, the largest economy and second largest economy, will fight a war. In other words, the three key parties concerned are not interested in military confrontation. Therefore, the chance of a war is extremely limited. But it's necessary to state that this does not mean that skirmishes may not occur between Japan and China. If poorly managed, skirmishes may occur, and what we should do is to prevent such skirmishes. Or if really it occurs, we try to prevent them from running out of control or into a military confrontation, which is achievable, in order to bring this issue under control, given no parties concerned really want to fight a war. In this regard, I think it's necessary perhaps to note a shift in China's overall strategic posture from what I call strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. In other words, China has drawn some clearer bottom lines. First, China prefers to solve all the territorial disputes through peaceful dialogues and negotiations. China has done this with most of its neighbors, from Russia to Pakistan, to Burma, to Nepal, etc. And even this formula put forward by Deng Xiaoping to shelve the dispute for joint development, whether with Japan or with those countries, China's neighborly countries, where China has territorial dispute in the South China Sea. So the idea is to shelve the dispute and to seek joint development. Personally, I think this is really a realistic, feasible, eventually perhaps the least bad option for all the parties concerned. In the end, after all the ups and downs, finally, perhaps that will be a solution. Yeah. And second, if one party, in this case of the Diaoyu Island, Japan, takes unilateral action to change the status quo, China may react with determination, reason, and certain amount of power. And third, door remains open to return to dialogue and peaceful negotiations for mutually acceptable and practical solutions. Even for the Diaoyu Islands, this door is wide open. From my point of view, this strategic clarity may well be an inevitable stage of building a more stable relationship in the Asia-Pacific region. China's strategic clarity, which in short term may cause a bit uneasiness, but in medium to long term may in fact help regional peace and stability on a long-term and predictable basis. Some claim, especially in the media, that China's current posture contradicts its claim to peaceful rise and peaceful development. In fact, this is, from my point of view, not entirely true. I can give an example of in the relationship between Beijing and Taipei. And Beijing put forward this concept of peaceful rise or peaceful development in the year 2003. But then, in the year 2005, which means 2 years later, Beijing adopted a law called anti-secession law, specifically stating that which refers to Taiwan, if Chinese part of China territory declares independent, Beijing will have no other choice but use non-peaceful means. At that moment, when the law was adopted, it caused a lot of controversy, and many claim China is being nationalistic and aggressive. But now, if we look back, actually, this law paved the way for a very dynamic relationship between Beijing, between mainland and Taiwan. Economic relations, cultural exchanges, social contacts are extremely, unprecedentedly dynamic. Indeed, my final words are, if all the parties can show decent respect for the core interests of other parties in the region and try to solve their differences through dialogues and negotiations, Asia-Pacific will remain the world's most dynamic region in the decades to come. And all the investors will continue to benefit from this dynamism and from the rise of China, from the unmatched dynamism prevailing in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Professor Zhang, thank you very much. The door is open, I think you said. So with that, Professor Yachi, could you be kind and share your thoughts?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me talk in the first place, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu problem, which is the most imminent geopolitical problem. And finally, the ongoing power shift or power transition between United States and China, and Japan's possible role in that context. First, TPP. Last weekend, Prime Minister Abe declared that Japan would participate in the TPP negotiation. This decision was made based on the positive result of the his summit meeting with President Obama last month. And for Japan, TPP has a following strategic significance. First, it will promote the revitalization of Japan's economy, which is the most important task for Abe administration, by allowing Japan to incorporate dynamism of economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region. Secondly, the Obama administration has clearly hammered out the policy of its return to Asia called pivoting or rebalancing. Japan's participation in the TPP is essential in this respect in order to solidify this basic position of the US government. It is desirable that two nations accumulate achievements by leading together the rule-making, which would contribute to the regional economic development. Third, TPP will accelerate Japan, China, ROK, FTA, and regional comprehensive economic partnership, so-called RCEP, whose negotiations are about to start in the full-fledged manner. They are not antagonistic to each other. And by the way, Japan is the only major economic power participating in these three negotiations. And as such, it can play a positive role as a rule maker. Now, Senkaku Islands. I don't want to get involved in the argument on the territorial sovereignty on the islands here, because this forum is not for them. Instead, I'd like to touch upon the geopolitical implications to the present situation surrounding the Senkaku Islands. First, international maritime order. Fierce demonstration and violent acts took place in more than 100 cities across China, causing significant damage to the Japanese companies there after the purchase of the island from its private owner by the Japanese government last September. Nowadays, intrusion by the Chinese government official vessels into Japan's territorial waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands occurs regularly, and the Chinese government aircraft have occasionally violated Japan's airspace. Last month, we also had an extremely dangerous act by a Chinese Navy vessel of aiming the fire control radar at an escort ship of Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force. China's hardline attitude is not targeted at Japan only. Since the 1970s, China has been conflicting with other countries such as Vietnam and the Philippines over islands and coral reef in the South China Sea in an attempt to establish territorial sovereignty on them. This method has also been used for the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea in attempt to, in this sense, Vietnam, the Philippines are on the same boat with Japan. During the foreign ministers' talks, Mr. Kerry, new U.S. Secretary of State, reaffirmed Mr. Kishida, Japan's new foreign minister, an unshakable position that the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty will apply to the Senkaku Islands. He also highly evaluated for exercising self-control against China's provocative acts. Second, maritime security. There is a growing demand in China calling for the construction and the development of so-called A2AD strategy within the waters demarcated by the first island chain and the second island chain, thereby eliminating from the said waters the control and influence of the U.S. Navy and ensuring free access by the Chinese Navy to the Pacific Ocean. The Senkaku Island, as well as Taiwan, can play a significant role in the Chinese maritime strategy. Although this is hard to believe, some in China have even shown their interest in the territorial sovereignty over the Ryukyu Islands. Therefore, we have to exercise utmost caution. Third, after the release of survey report in 1969, the Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, ECAFE, which indicated that there might exist prominent sedimentary layers of oil and gas in the north to Taiwan, and subsequently China, for the first time began to claim that Senkaku Islands are theirs. In other words, the energy issue is involved here. Now, I should say that what then will be the solution for the Senkaku debate or dispute. Naturally, constructive solution must be worked out by peaceful means, not by force. And the rule of international law must be abided by. If China insists on their argument on the territorial claim and want to go to the International Court of Justice, Japan, I believe, should accept her invitation for solving the problem by peaceful means, and ICJ would be a very fair and appropriate place to solve. We also need to promptly create a mechanism by which escalation of conflicts between Japan and China will be avoided and controlled. Then let me talk about the so-called power shift or power transition between the United States and China. It seems to be taking place between the two countries, but if so, what shape will it form? Will China soon outstrip the economic and military power of the United States, forming a bipolar structure like the one established during the Cold War? Or will it form a collaborative relationship with the United States in the process of balancing out the distribution of power? It is hard to make an assured prediction, but what becomes important here is whether or not China can respect universal values such as freedom, human rights, democracy, rule of law, and communicate well the world, and whether or not it can get along with the international order shared among advanced democratic nations originated in Europe. Any nation seeking to assume a leading position in the world must pass the test, questioning if the nation can signal a universally persuasive message to other countries, and if, as a result, it can acquire centripetal force from many countries around the world. Frankly speaking, China has not been so far successful in this sense. Obviously, there is a role that Japan can play even amidst a relative decline in the natural power in order to help power shift to move towards a favorable direction for the international community as a whole. First, Japan must continue to be a reliable allied partner of the United States. A solid Japan-US alliance has been and will be international public goods for peace, stability, and even prosperity in the region. Secondly, Japan needs to construct a security network in the broader term with emerging Asian nations, Australia, India, the Republic of Korea, ASEAN, which are rising in a significant fashion. Prime Minister Abe and other influential ministers visited those countries recently, and it is of great significance that Japan contribute to making a framework for a free and open maritime order, as well as a free and open international trade and economic regime in cooperation with them, and those efforts must be supported United States and also hopefully by China. Thirdly, the leaders of Japan, of both Japan and China, must always refer to their joint statement on comprehensive promotion of a mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests, which was announced in May 2008. It said, for instance, that Japan and China now bear a solemn responsibility for peace, stability, and development of the Asia-Pacific region and the world. I would like to repeat, both leaders of two countries should always respect this declared statement which was made in 2008. Thank you very much.
Professor Yachi, excuse me, thank you very much. Finally, Dr. Burrows.
Well, thanks to Credit Suisse and the organizers of the conference. I'm really enjoying so far the conference and want to say that I think this panel is actually one of the most interesting and exciting from terms of analysis. I wanted to go back to the work that I put together for the National Intelligence Council, and it's the work that's used by the US government in thinking about medium to longer term trends. And if you go into the work, you'll notice that in this edition, we looked at this question of geopolitical rivalry, tensions in East Asia. In fact, this is the first time we have really featured this as a part of the regional and global landscape. So if we go back to the original question that we're been asked to address here, which is rhetoric or threat, I'd have to say that I'm a little bit more on the threat side than the rhetoric. But I'd have to also say that, however, cautious we have to be, however, however threatening this is, I think this, and I agree with the other two speakers, I think this is a manageable situation, but one in which it's not going to be easily resolved. There are too many different factors moving all at the same time, and one that we need to keep into consideration the historical parallels here that would really make us very cautious and concerned about this situation. If you contrast Asia security to European security, the one glaring difference is there's no institutional structure for really dealing with these disputes. And you don't have that track record, which the Europeans now have over generations since the Second World War of really dealing with these disputes in a manageable way within, as I say, an institutional framework. So, and that framework is not easily going to be set up over the next decade or two. So that's the overall picture. You're facing that obviously both sides, and you have multiple sides if you want to elevate this beyond just the Sino-Japanese disputes, multiple sides in this, all feeling that they have either grievances, claims, whatever, but don't really have a mechanism for solving it collectively and building that collective security. You also have, and this is the concerning part of it, you have rising nationalisms in all the countries. And that's, what, as I say, you have to particularly worry about is that with those nationalisms and the weaknesses that are likely to occur among all the players, among all the governments, that you'll have there a spark for elevating tensions into a much more serious situation. Now, I think, and I would agree with both the speakers, that there is so much incentive not to elevate those tensions into a conflict, that's the likely outcome is that over 5-10 years we'll have these simmering disputes, but we won't actually have something that elevates into a much more serious conflict. The other thing that I would point out, which concerns me and concerns us when we look at the region, is that you have two dynamics going on. You have one with China being the economic driver in the region. And then you have another where security, increasingly, the states around China are looking to the United States for their security. And I would say over the longer run, that also creates its own issues, its own sources of tensions. And that, again, because you don't have any institutionalized framework for melding, putting all of these different factors together. The best outcome would be if you have a strong US, strong Japan, strong China. Now, I say that knowing that in terms of military capabilities of all the three players, you know, those also would be enhanced in that scenario. But I think in terms of the governments being able to deal with nationalism, deal with their publics, they're going to be in a stronger position to make the sort of deals, to do the sort of concessions, one or the other, in order to avoid and in order to get some resolution to the problem. Now that is, you know, over the 10 years, you're seeing transformations in all those main players, Japan, China, US, and also other countries in the region. China is trying to move towards a much more innovative economy that has stresses, political stresses connected with it. Japan is trying to revitalize its economy through TPP, other internal changes, and the US itself has political stresses, trying to get out of its recession, high unemployment, deal with its entitlement fiscal issues. So those, you have a very delicate situation going in all the three countries, a very unpredictable transition actually happening. And that's why, again, going back to my first statement, that's the concern. Obviously, you know, one of those factors going in a negative direction and be the source of a spark that elevates this situation up to a higher level. Now, we have about 10 minutes left, so I will stop here because I know the moderator is very anxious to begin the discussion. But thank you again for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I'm going to start with one quick question and then turn it to the floor. We will get some questions in. Three very interesting presentations and speeches. We didn't talk about North Korea. Is there an opportunity for an entente cordiale developing with China and the US, and maybe the US and Japan, therefore, in a new problem or a revisited problem? Maybe if we just follow down the path.
Okay, concerning North Korea, I think indeed this nuclear tests conducted by North Korea has undermined China's core interests. So China joined the international community to sanction North Korea. But in order to resolve the whole issue, crisis in the Korean Peninsula, we have to see this issue in a broader range of the context. The main issue for me is on the part of, say, after the end of the Cold War, Japan, United States, South Korea remain allies. So there's still Cold War political and military structure. But on the part of North Korea, Russia, or in the past Soviet Union, and China, this situation has already changed. This military and political alliance did not exist. So North Korea is perhaps the most insecure country in this power structure. So how to solve this problem and give certain amount of security, sense of security to North Korea in the long term, medium to long term? This is the key issue.
Thank you.
I think there's all the countries, including China, Japan, US, obviously, they have the same interest here of trying to solve this issue and certainly not allow the instability that's created by it to spread. So essentially, it is more of an opportunity. And I think, you know, the changes that have happened, particularly on China's view, perhaps provides us with a near-term to medium-term opportunity. And the more we can get talks, I think the more then you lower the possibility for greater instability down the road.
Around 10 years ago, the then Prime Minister Koizumi visited Pyongyang to talk with Mr. Kim Jong-il. Mr. Koizumi said very strongly that which one is for your national interest? That North Korea with nuclear weapons, North Korea without nuclear weapons. If you choose North Korea without nuclear weapons, and of course missile too, or Japan, Korea, the Republic of Korea and USA are ready to cooperate to help your economic growth and so on. So it's quite natural for your country to go without nuclear weapons, but he didn't accept. And it seems to be the new leader in North Korea is also determined to go nuclear. And we have been talking with the Chinese friends always. I personally talked with the Chinese friends that your country, China, has the most important position to hold the key for North Korea. If, I would say very frankly, if you stop the supply of energy or food, then North Korea will be very difficult to continue the survival. So I hope, and we hope, that China will play a positive role to stop nuclear North Korea. And then this was not done, or the Chinese friends says that we don't have such a strong influence over North Korea. But problem is that the North Korea will go nuclear, whatever we say. And I don't know. They are going to the very disastrous way, the terrible economic condition, and go nuclear, and being isolated internationally. And what will happen to North Korea if the leadership of North Korea are reasonable or rational? The answer will be very clear: stop the nuclear weapons. I don't know if they will go that way or not.
Thank you. Okay, can we take a question from the floor if there is any? If there are any. My goodness, people are thinking. Let me ask a separate question, and it's completely biased. I'm an energy guy. How much of the current tension do we believe is resource-driven at its heart, and how much of it is really driven by deeper nationalistic differences?
Well, I think this energy demand in China is indeed increasing. But actually, I think it's less an issue of energy, because this foreign dispute over the Diaoyu Islands started in early 1970s, before China's reform program started, before China's real modernization took off. It's fierce, heated debate in Chinese mainland, in Taiwan, among overseas Chinese communities. So really, it's, as you know, although China and Japan have established diplomatic relations, there are still issues left over from the Second World War. And you have to understand this, the Japan's invasion of China has caused untold sufferings to the Chinese families. Almost each and every family has suffered somewhat. But from a Chinese perspective, Japan keeps the same national flag, same national anthem. It's unlike Germany, totally different. Of course, Japanese leaders still go to this shrine honoring war criminals, etc. All these are deeply offensive. I think it's more a political issue than an energy issue, but they're intertwined.
Thank you.
I would agree that it's more of a nationalistic based issue than one over competition over resources. And in fact, if you again go back to the analogy with Europe, it could be an opportunity. If you get to a place where you can actually exploit together the resources, then that can build actually a framework for a lot more cooperation, as what happened in Europe with the coal and steel community.
I think there is no difficult problem which we can't overcome. And Chinese and Japanese should continue dialogue and to solve the problems. I think that would be possible. And so dialogue, consultation, and those peaceful things are most important. And I'd like to repeat again, please read that 2008 joint communiqué was a comprehensive promotion of the mutually strategic relationship. In that statement, there are many suggestions and also clues for solving the problems.
Wonderful. We have 1 minute left. Oh, gentleman there. Let's take a quick question.
This is for Mr. Yachi. What is Japan's view as to the reason that China has not done more to rein in the North Korean nuclear program? Because you appear to believe that they can, and so why haven't they done it?
Maybe I'm not a so appropriate person to answer to your question. But anyway, I think China deemed the North Korea as a kind of a buffer zone, say against USA, against South Korea or Japan. And to keep the North Korea as a buffer zone is contributive to the national interest of China. And so they don't want to, and also they believe that the nuclear Korea will never attack China. If they say so, if they do so, that must be Japan or maybe South Korea. I don't think that China is encouraging that, but so just status quo on the Korean Peninsula would be a pretty comfortable situation for China. That's my observation.
Well, I think we could sit here for another hour and continue to discuss, but somebody's waving a flag at the back that says, please wrap up. So unfortunately, we're going to have to stop at that point. Thank you all for coming, and please thank warmly our three guests for their